Hi, my name is Connie Fabry. I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Baton Rouge Industry Alliance. Today we are celebrating our 55th year as an association, and we're celebrating 55 years of innovation. Our organization was started in 1970, and its focus has been on craft workforce development, or workforce development in general for all the careers in industry, as well as safety, best practice improvements, and outreach into the community to communicate with our public and our communities on the value of industry and help them understand that when they purchase things at a Walmart or at the Home Depot, that many of those products start right here in our backyards in Louisiana. This conference is very important because it's the beginning of our year. Especially this year, it marks 55 years of industry in this community working together, collaborating to make improvements for the citizens and the plants that are here, to work together and make improvements that keep people safer, keep our communities healthier, and provide excellent jobs and provide for the community.
My name is Tom Ura. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Site Director for UBE C1 Chemicals America. We're here today at GBRIA at our annual meeting celebrating 55 years of innovation. This is a spot where industry leaders from across the region will come together to talk about important issues from workforce development, safety, public outreach. We're going to have discussions on talking about some of the first steps on producing low carbon hydrogen for fuels, as well as chemical supply, as well as ammonia. We're also going to be having discussions with fuel and talking about the state's future in energy diversification. This organization helps Louisiana through two of our pillars. One of our pillars is workforce investment. We, as leaders, work to help not only create the jobs, but also to educate and create an environment where people can come up through the high school systems, the secondary systems, and actually get good paying jobs in our industry. But craft workforce development sits at our core. We are the group of people that help establish organizations like Associated Builders and Contractors local chapters, where men and women can come and get craft training to go and get many of these high paying jobs. That becomes very important for us as we embark on increasing our manufacturing capabilities in the state, supporting a circular economy. GBRIA's annual conference is important because it's not only a networking opportunity, it's an opportunity to share best practices. It's an opportunity for us to get together as a community, amplify our voices, and then help us understand the best way to communicate to the public, state officials, and our local community on the importance of our industry in the state.
Chance to talk now about the economy and where we are in the business cycle and what this means for America and, of course, in Louisiana. My presentation today is entitled Monetary Masala. It is a play on a 1991 film called Mississippi Masala, which starred the two actors that you see on the screen, Denzel Washington, an actor with whom you are quite familiar, and also the Indian-British actress Sarita Choudhury. This was Sarita Choudhury's debut, as it turns out, in 1991. I've admired her work for many, many decades. In fact, I met Sarita Choudhury at JFK Airport. She was on the same flight as I was from New York to New Delhi, and I actually approached her and started talking to her, and I believed that if I had another 15 seconds of her time, I could have changed both of our lives. But it didn't work out that way. So I'm going to stick with Denzel Washington as the unifying theme of this presentation. You'll see that theme throughout the presentation. And let me talk now about the most salient aspect of economic life in America in recent years, which has been that inflation rate. The fact that inflation is no longer 2%, hasn't been for quite some time now. This is based or a play on the 2009 film, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, in which Denzel Washington stars as a train dispatcher. But in any case, let's look at some data. Two measures of inflation on the chart here. So this 12-month percentage change in prices. The green line there represents inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index, the most prominent measure of inflation among Americans. And that indicates that over the past 12 months, which we have data, which is December of 2023 to December of 2024, inflation is measured by CPI running at 2.9%. The line below that in dark blue is inflation as measured by the core PCE deflator, the personal consumption expenditures deflator. That is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation. That says inflation running at 2.4% year over year. In neither instance is inflation at the Federal Reserve's 2% target. As everyone knows here, the Federal Reserve met yesterday and announced that they were not changing interest rates, keeping them where they are. We'll talk more about the Federal Reserve as we go through the presentation. You might also notice, if you can see the end of the data series, and much of the data I will share with you today are time series data, so the more contemporary data to the right of the slide, that in fact inflation on a year-over-year basis has been rising recently. In other words, that 2% target has proven increasingly elusive in recent periods, which again has pinned the Federal Reserve to current rates of interest as opposed to continuing to cut them. Again, we'll talk more about the Federal Reserve as we go through the presentation. Now, we economists love to talk about inflation in the context of Federal Reserve policy making and interest rates and stock market performance, so on and so forth, but there are other implications to inflation, including for the American household. Household expenditures comprise roughly 70% of aggregate demand, so let's focus on the consumer a little bit. So this is inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. What I'm doing for you here is I'm going back to May of 2020. Why that month is the baseline? That is the first month of the current economic expansion. So America loses 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start to add back jobs in May of 2020, and according to the National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee, the official end date of the recession was April of 2020. So if you go back to May of 2020 and look at price levels as they were as measured by the Consumer Price Index, compare those to December of 2024, the last month to which we have these data, here are the comparisons. So a bit more than a 4.5 year comparison period. So over those 4.5 years, the headline numbers are down below. Overall inflation in this country running at around 23%, in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Strip out food and energy prices, you get the so-called core rate of inflation. That is 21% year over year. You can see some of the categories in which you have the most inflation in green. Transportation services, those are shipping costs up nearly 50%, 48% roughly over the past 4.5 years. Why is that? Well, one of the aspects of economic life in America has been that we've also seen very rapid wage growth, and wage growth and price growth tend to move hand in hand often. I'll give you an example. We've had tons of labor strife in this country in recent years. We had strikes among actors and writers. We had a strike in October of last year among International Longshoremen's Association members, so on and so forth. Now, some negotiations have not ended in strikes. I'll give you an example. The negotiations between United Parcel Service and the Teamsters Union, those negotiations back in 2023 produced a 5-year agreement, and during that 5th year of that agreement, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per year. That's $170K. That's wages plus benefits, but it's $170K. Forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app, spectacular. But the point is, when you have that kind of wage pressure, that also leads to price pressure. You see that in that transportation services category. Shelter costs, that includes things like apartment rents, up 25%. Energy prices up nearly 50%. Food costs up about 24%. And that's what really has many Americans exercised, by the way. I mean, why are Americans so upset with the economy, or why have they been so upset with the economy? You look at the economy, last year the US economy grew 2.8% in terms of gross domestic product. We have 4.1% unemployment, over 8 million available unfilled jobs. Wage growth has been rapid, including among the most entry level of workers. And yet people are unhappy right here. They can't keep up with these price increases. And again, it's that grocery bill, that food charge that has the most exercise. One of the things I do as an economist is I speak to a lot of people about the economy. And these conversations often transpire in Ubers and Lyfts. And I take a lot of Ubers and Lyfts. I'll take one after this presentation back to the airport here to fly back to Baltimore via Atlanta. And many of you take lots of Ubers and Lyfts. And those of you who do know that as a passenger you rate the driver, you may be less than what the driver rates you as a passenger. And I have very recently become privy to my passenger ratings, and they're extremely low. And you might say, well, that makes sense, sir. We've been watching you speak now for 5 minutes. I think this is beyond my personality. that there's something else afoot, because I take every trip with an Uber or Lyft driver as an opportunity to interview an American. And I'll ask the question, like, and of course I'm doing this from the back seat, I'll ask the question like, hey, how much do you really make doing this on an hourly basis once you factor in depreciation, gasoline, and insurance? What's your highest level of educational attainment? What other options did you have? Did you have any? Do you view this as a career? Why would you choose this vehicle in particular? And apparently these questions are off-putting. But when you ask people about the economy, the number one thing they will tell you is, this is what has me frustrated. I can't keep up. Now, again, there is an interest rate implication to this. And one of the other aspects of this is now we have a new president, of course. I believe this is day 11 for him, inaugurated January 20th. And so some policies that have been proposed, and I won't go through all of these, but extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, to the extent that that pushes more money into the economy, that would tend to be inflationary. Tariffs across the board, let's say 10% or wherever they're going to be, that would tend to be inflationary. Deportations, people view immigration policy differently, of course, but to the extent that that limits access to certain people who have been providing services, including in the U.S. construction industry, but also in restaurant and other categories, that would tend to be inflationary. So that chase for 2% inflation is fairly elusive at this time, and no surprise, therefore, interest rates remain elevated. Now, here's an interest rate of interest. This is the principal mechanism by which the Federal Reserve influences economic growth and its byproduct of inflation, the federal funds rate, also known as the Fed funds rate, also known as the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another. Why would a bank do that? Because banks require a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of themselves, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When this rate is set at a higher level, an opposing behavior ensues. Now again, this burst of inflation shows up in early 2021. That's when prices really take off, as the economy is reopening in earnest from the pandemic, and we have all those supply chain challenges. The Federal Reserve doesn't do anything about that inflation in 2021. They view that inflation to be transitory, a word with which we're now all familiar. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think this is very temporary, purely supply chain driven. The supply chain is normalized post-pandemic. Inflation just naturally abates to that 2% level that we had enjoyed for many years prior to the pandemic. Instead, the Federal Reserve presides over the creation of wage price spiral. So wages take off in 2021 as prices take off. Now in 2022, the Federal Reserve starts to push back on that. March 17th of 2022, they begin their rate hiking cycle, but even then, they only dip their toes in inflation-fighting waters that day, raising rates 0.25 percentage points, but next meeting 0.5 percentage points, next 4 meetings consecutively 0.75 percentage points each meeting, then back to 0.5 percentage points, then 0.25, then 0.25. May of 2023, another 0.25 pause in June. July 26th of 2023, another 0.25 pause for 8 meetings. And then September 18th of last year, they started cutting rates. That was a 0.5 percentage point cut. Everyone was delighted by that, at least in the stock market. Then 2 days after election, November 7th, another 1/4 point rate cut. December 18th of last year, another 1/4 point rate cut. Yesterday, no action. But what that means is, and if you look at the slide, interest rates are still high. Monetary policy is not particularly accommodative to growth. Borrowing costs are elevated, and for industries like real estate and construction that are especially interest rate sensitive, this has some meaningful implications, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. And now the Federal Reserve is stuck. There was a conventional wisdom as of mid-September of last year, when it looked like Kamala Harris still had a chance to win the presidency, that the Federal Reserve would cut rates 6 times in 2025. Now the bond market is saying maybe once, maybe twice, and that's it. So interest rates are likely to stay higher for longer, and again, we'll talk about the implications. Now, here's the thing. Despite those elevated interest rates, the U.S. economy has continued to perform swimmingly. The broadest indication of that is right here. Growth in national output is measured by gross domestic product. Just got data this morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. During the 4th quarter of the year, the U.S. economy expands 2.3% on an annualized basis, after growing 3.1% during the 3rd quarter, 3% during the 2nd, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. economy had a good year last year. So after growing about 2.5% in 2023, 2.8% last year, the economy continues to entered 2025 with plentiful momentum. And at the heart of that statement is the American consumer. As the consumer has been on a spending tear, these are retail sales, monthly data, through December. As you know, we had a record Black Friday. We had a record Cyber Monday. The consumer continues to be spending aggressively. Or you hear stories. So for instance, Starbucks has had a few rough quarters. They'll tell you that their occasional customers disappeared. The customers who showed up after the pandemic and who are for the first time buying $5 no-foam soy milk upside down vanilla lattes, grande. That for whatever reason, we'll talk about that reason later on in the presentation, they're no longer frequenting Starbucks as much. In fact, Starbucks just changed their CEO. The previous CEO is a guy named Lakshman Narasimhan, who looks just like me, as it turns out, but he was replaced by a new CEO from Chipotle, Brian Niccol, who looks nothing like me. So you hear stories out there, but the other thing I want to point out is that much of the growth in consumer outlays recently has not been on retail items here depicted, but rather on services, things like travel. So every once in a while, the Americans will set another record in terms of the number of people pass through TSA checkpoints on a single day. They're spending on Beyonce concert tickets, they're spending on Taylor Swift concert tickets. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket purchased on resale, and that's how people buy them on resale, sold for $1,619 per ticket. She sold at football stadiums in the country often multiple times in the same week, in the same town. She just toured Australia, parenthetically. The Australian government thanked her for improving their economy. She generated about $300 million of economic impact in 4 days. She's not merely a musical phenomenon, she's an economic one. And I would say to you that this thing between her and Travis Kelce is pretty much the greatest thing ever. This is exactly what this nation needed during these tumultuous times. It's fabulous, it's phenomenal, it is fantastic. It is not at all annoying. And what you have here is this hunky athlete from the Kansas City Chiefs, 3-time Super Bowl winning tight end Travis Kelce, in a relationship with the savvy singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. There are pictures of them kissing on the internet. Now, some of that's artificially generated, but the point is, this has many Americans aglow, abuzz, and hopeful, and there is reason for hope. Because unlike many stories, this one stands to end well, because when that breakup occurs, and it will occur, the music is going to flow, and I, for one, cannot wait. Now, I'm going to make the case later on in the presentation that the consumer probably cannot continue to spend as they have been, but we're not there yet. Something else that surprised me, right here, total US household wealth. America has never been wealthier. In 2024, America's households collectively reported about $160 billion in $160 trillion in collective wealth. Now, it is true that wealth is not equally distributed across the economy, so a lot of growth in people's portfolios, a lot of growth in the value of people's homes, but again, that wealth has not been equally distributed, has not been for a long time. So these data come from the Federal Reserve, as do these. This is a breakdown of American wealth by percentile. So what I'm doing for you here is I'm simply stacking the most affluent households in America down to the least affluent and asking the question, where does the wealth reside in America? So if you look at the slice at the very top there, I'd call that a teal. That's the wealth controlled by the top 0.1% of Americans. There are about 340,000 of them. And that top 0.1% of Americans controls not quite 14% of the nation's wealth. If you look at the slice below that, it's in green. That's the wealth controlled by the balance of the top 1%. That's your 99th percentile, your 99.9th percentile. They control another not quite 17% of the nation's wealth. So the top 1% controls around 31% of the nation's wealth. If you look at the light blue slice under that, that's the wealth controlled by the balance of the top 10%. So that's your 90th percentile to your 99th percentile. They control another 36.5% roughly of the nation's wealth. So the top 10% controls almost precisely 2/3 of the nation's wealth. If you look at the darker blue segment below that, that's the wealth controlled by the 50th percentile to 90th percentile. That's 40% of America's population, and they control in the range of 30 to 31% of America's wealth, which means that the bottom 50% of Americans control 2.4% of the nation's wealth. So top 50%, 97.6%, bottom 50%, 2.4%. Some of these folks in the bottom 50% are homeowners. The homeownership rate in America is meaningfully above 60%. But they don't have much financial wealth. They're by and large living paycheck to paycheck. So now what do you need in a country that has such uneven wealth distribution? Well, obviously, what you need is an equalizer. And what has been the equalizer? So wealth inequality has blossomed in America, but income inequality not as much. And again, in percentage terms at least, often we've observed the most rapid wage growth in percentage terms among people who are at or near the entry level. That's restaurant workers and many other workers. And so where's the job market right now? Well, it's still in pretty good shape. There are still lots of job openings in the economy. In fact, according to the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, in November, America home to 8.1 million available unfilled jobs. You must say, anybody notice the number of job openings have been falling over time. That's true. The labor market has been normalizing post-pandemic, but we still have more job openings now than we did pre-pandemic. Back then, we had a 3.5% rate of unemployment. The economy was deemed to be very, very strong. That was a 50-year low in unemployment in this country. We had about 7 million available unfilled jobs, now 8.1 million. And it's still the case that we have more job openings in this country than we do unemployed people. Now, for those of you who are in construction, there are quite a few of you, construction job openings have been not as strong. That's true, and we'll talk more about the construction labor market. But when a nation enters each and every month with plentiful numbers of jobs, it is quite likely that the nation will end up adding jobs the ensuing month. And that's exactly what's happened in America since December of 2020. So this is a monthly job change in America. December 2020 was a COVID-intensive month. But through wildfires and elections, hurricanes, bridge collapses, America's managed to add jobs every month since December of 2020. Last reading here is for December of 2024, a month during which America adds another 256,000 net new jobs. Unemployment fell that month to 4.1%. It's fairly impressive. And we are now at a point in which wage growth exceeds inflation. So there's too much going on this slide. But I'm trying to juxtapose two data series here and take the 12-month percentage change in each of them respectively. So if you look at the blue-colored line there, that's inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. If you look at the green line there, that's growth on a 12-month basis in average hourly earnings. And so if you look at the most recent data, toward the right of the slide again, average hourly earnings have come to exceed inflation, meaning that people are making real wage gains. And that's been true since roughly May of 2023. So that virtuous cycle remains in place in which consumers are spending, impacted employers are hiring, which of course fuels further spending. That's, again, very good news. Now, if we look at Louisiana, the situation is a bit different. So the nation since February of 2020, and why am I using that as the baseline here? February of 2020 is the last month before we shut down the economy. So if you look at job totals between February of 2020 and December of 2024, so again, a bit more than a 4.5-year comparison, over that period, America added a bit more than 7 million jobs, but Louisiana has yet to recover all the jobs that were lost early during the pandemic. And it's one of the handful of states to be able to make that claim that it's yet to recover fully. Another state is my state of Maryland, very soft recovery there as well. You will notice, however, that much of the job loss is in the category toward the top, leisure and hospitality. People have different theories about why it is that that sector has not fully recovered. Some people think it might be sales taxes, that kind of thing, or just difficulty recruiting restaurant and hotel workers because of ongoing skilled worker shortages, those kinds of things. In any case, now, Baton Rouge, as you know, has been an exception. Baton Rouge has been the principal driver of economic growth in Louisiana. And another market, Lafayette, has been fairly stable. Much of the job loss has been in the New Orleans metropolitan area, as it turns out. The state's population, by the way, has not grown rapidly. It's roughly where it was pre-Katrina, roughly where it was in 2005 before the population loss associated with Katrina. So, and there's a neat correspondence between population growth and employment growth. And so, in any case, Baton Rouge here, employment growth, you can see there the green color bars are categories of job growth, and it's been quite strong performance. And I'm going to make the case later on in the presentation that it's going to get much, much stronger in this region in terms of economic dynamism. I'm not just saying that to kowtow to the audience. I mean, that's part of it. But for earnest reasons, and that I'll share with you later on in the presentation. This gives you some more regional economic data. So this is percentage employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. Again, there's a neat correspondence between population growth and job growth. So the left-hand column includes those regions that have been adding the jobs the fastest in percentage terms since February of 2020, again, the last month before we shut down the economy. In recent years, as it turns out, no region of the country has added more people in absolute terms than the Dallas metropolitan area. It's not even close. North Texas is booming. Flat land, very developable, plentiful rainfall, favorable zoning, favorable tax policy, so on and so forth, perceived high quality of life, all those things. By the way, no region of the country overpays their quarterback as much as the Dallas metropolitan area, but I'm persuaded that those things are purely coincidental. But you'll notice it's the American South. It's markets like Dallas, Tampa, Charlotte that lead the way. That's where the population growth has been. That's where the job growth has been. The right-hand column includes those regions that have not added jobs as quickly. Let's see, New York Metro, Washington Metro, my town of Baltimore, Boston. Not as much population growth, not as much job growth. Also the monsters in the Midwest, those major Midwestern markets like Chicagoland, Detroit Metro, and Minneapolis. Also, again, less population growth translating into less job growth. These are unemployment rates for those same 25 major metropolitan areas. And now you see a different story emerging in America. If you just look at the headline jobs numbers, one could question why economists continue to make the case that the economy is slowing. Again, 256,000 jobs added in December. Unemployment falls to 4.1%. 8 million job openings. How is the labor market slowing? If you look toward the bottom of the right-hand column here, you will note that some of these unemployment rates are no longer that low. So Los Angeles, Detroit Metro, at or above 5%, Riverside, California. And so at least in certain parts of the country, we're starting to see this virtuous cycle in which consumers are spending and employers are hiring start to break down just a bit. It is taking unemployed workers longer now to find their next job relative to the past. I'll share more data with you on this later on, very late in the presentation as it turns out. But for now, let's go to another part of the presentation. So again, the economy's had momentum. By the way, this is based on a movie, Devil in a Blue Dress, in which Denzel Washington plays the part of Easy Rawlins. This movie is rooted in Los Angeles. In any case, he can look good doing anything, by the way. And one of my hopes is that he learns that I'm doing a presentation with him as the theme, and that he will at some point agree to meet with me and just say one time, my man, just one time to me. That would be like my dream come true, basically. So, but in any case, I doubt it's going to happen. Anyway, setting that aside, there are some threats to the economy. Let's talk about those. Now, I mentioned the consumers have been spending. You see it yourself. Consumers out there. When you board an airplane, it's usually full. Those kinds of things. But can they continue to spend this way? So this is personal savings. Again, Federal Reserve Bank data, but this time this analysis is from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So if you look at the green line toward the bottom of the slide, that's personal savings measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And you can see a reasonably smooth trajectory in personal savings as we move toward the pandemic, but then the pandemic changes everything. Because during the pandemic, many Americans received stimulus payments, not everyone, but almost everyone. Many Americans experienced significant compensation increase during the pandemic, and of course we thank them for working through the pandemic, whether at pharmacies, outpatient medical centers, construction job sites, etc. But that meant that for many Americans, household income was rising precisely when their expenditures were dwindling because they weren't taking vacations. They weren't going to movies or plays. They weren't seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift or even Ice Spice or SZA. And so, according to the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank economists, at the pinnacle, the American household amassed about $2.1 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. According to the same economists, all of those savings and then some have now been spent down. A $2.4 trillion drawdown in household savings. Now, of course, as those savings are being spent, it juiced the economy. Again, 2.5% growth last year, 2.8% growth last year, 2.5% the year before. But now what are you left with increasingly? A consumer who has spent down their pandemic-era savings and continues to face high and rising prices. But they're going to continue to spend. Why? Because once you establish a certain standard of living, once you live in a certain caliber of apartment, eat at a certain quality of restaurant, take a certain type of vacation, one does not want to give up that standard of living, even if that improved standard of living is driven by essentially temporary factors like stimulus payments. But if the pandemic or savings are gone and the prices keep rising, how do you make the math work? Well, of course, you turn to the credit card. New York Federal Reserve Bank data regarding credit card debt, it is spiking. You have heard that credit card delinquency is rising, auto loan delinquency is rising, and I spoke recently to a group of apartment managers in the Mid-Atlantic conferences in Washington, D.C., and they told me that delinquency in rent payments is starting to rise too. No surprise. But there are other risks in the economy as well, including the pervasiveness of remote work and the impact on certain segments of commercial real estate. These are your highest downtown office vacancy rates in America. And by the way, if you looked at that slide with the 25 metropolitan areas and percentage job growth, you might have noticed that there was only one region of the country that had failed among those top 25 markets to add back the jobs lost earlier during the pandemic, and that was the San Francisco metropolitan area. And you'll notice on this chart, downtown San Francisco has the highest vacancy rate, almost 40%. Los Angeles, a massive office market, nearly a third vacant. And of course, we care about the building owners and the losses they might be taking in terms of rental revenue and the value of their properties. But we also care about the bank's exposure to this, because the banks hold these buildings often as collateral. I'll give you an example. About 4.5 months ago, the Wall Street Journal featured an article devoted to downtown St. Louis. Now, St. Louis is a beautiful, historic American city, and the tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the 44-story AT&T building. In 2006, that building sold for $205 million. It just sold for $3.5 million. Somebody takes that loss. Could be a series of equity holders in the building who chased that valuation down from purchase to purchase, but it also could be some bank's collateral. In my own city of Baltimore, 1 South Street, a prominent fixture on our skyline, sold for $66 million in 2015, recently sold for $24 million, and PNC, a major US bank, took a haircut on that deal. And many bankers will tell me, look, Anirban, so far we don't call it pretend and extend, we call it extend and amend. So change the payment terms, because we don't want to take ownership of the building. And the notion was that as interest rates fell, these property owners would be able to refinance their mortgages. But interest rates are not falling. That refinancing opportunity is disappearing. And the value of the collateral keeps falling in many of these markets, which means the longer the banks wait to foreclose on the property, the less they get back, because the collateral value keeps falling. In fact, you would expect under such circumstances that commercial real estate defaults and delinquencies would be rising. That's exactly what you see here. US commercial real estate foreclosures have been on the rise since roughly mid-2023. And I think there's more of that to transpire. And that, of course, can cost banks capital, and that can also make them less eager to lend, especially in real estate markets. Okay, enough of that. Let's now move to a section of the presentation I think in which you'll have the most interest. Actually, I'm going to use this as a segue into that. I'm going to talk more deeply about real estate. This is Denzel Washington, 2016 film, playing the part of a Pittsburgh sanitation worker. And if you can look good being from Pittsburgh, you can look good under any circumstance. So let me again talk about some interest rates of interest. 30-year fixed mortgage rate here in blue, 15-year fixed mortgage rate in green. So let me start residentially. These data come from Freddie Mac. They're weekly data, and over the last week for which you have data, if memory serves, I can't see the slides, the last weekly data point was that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate stood at 6.96%. Let's run it to 7%. So Anirban, assuredly, you're not going to make a big deal out of a 7% 30-year fixed mortgage rate, are you? Because I can remember mortgage rates for 18%. I can remember when they were 15%, fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, the youngest members of our workforce, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really dropped out of the single-family home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I'm going to share with you a number of leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been occurring to a discussion of what's likely to occur going forward. Here's a leading indicator. This is mortgage applications, the index. Why are mortgage applications a leading indicator? Because often the journey to the settlement table begins with a mortgage application. That's the first indication that we have as economists that somebody out there now seeks to transact. But mortgage applications are about 78% from their 2021 peak. So what does that tell us? There are fewer ready buyers out there. Fewer people who are prepared to transact. They have not applied for a mortgage yet. So under such circumstances, Anirban, housing market must be in horrific shape. If the buying population has been so dramatically truncated, things must be really horrific, but by many measures, as you know, they are not. Take U.S. home sales prices as measured by the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. Home sales prices in America have never been higher. Something I would not have predicted when mortgage rates took off in 2022, but that's exactly what's happened. Well, how can this be? What did I fail to appreciate as an economist? You see that increase in home sales prices during the pandemic and early stages of recovery therefrom? That's a 35% increase in U.S. home sales prices. But of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. We're spending more time at home, so we wanted more square footage. We wanted or needed room for home offices and home gyms. We wanted one room just for the Peloton. And that's how we Americans seek to live. Anytime you see a Peloton advertisement, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. I mean, as an American, you buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, lock the door. And then, of course, when people visit, you open the door, splash some water on it. Many of us have done it. But the point is, then the pandemic ended, and mortgage rates took off. So what was I thinking naively that we'd give back a meaningful chunk of those home sales prices? Because you can see it happened for a few months, but not very long and not very deep. What did I fail to appreciate? What did I get wrong? I understood there are fewer buyers out there. What I failed to fully understand was how few sellers there would be. Because if you're sitting in Duluth, Minnesota, or Kankakee, Illinois, with a 2.75% 30-year fixed, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. So you don't have many buyers, you don't have many sellers, and you're stuck with a high equilibrium sales price. Now, I will say that, if you look at the last year, so I'm just looking at percentage change in various markets covered by this index in terms of home price appreciation. So this is the 12-month percentage change in home sales price. That looks pretty good. The 0% line is toward the left. Everything is growing in terms of home sales prices, but mortgage rates have taken off recently. Affordability is down. And so if you look just at the last month of data, this is just the 1 month change in the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index for these metropolitan areas, the 0% line is toward the middle of the slide now. And a lot of markets actually are seeing home sales prices fall. So again, the effect of these higher interest rates lasting for longer, starting to wear on certain segments of the economy, including, as it turns out, the residential component of the economy. And these dynamics also influence construction activity as well. Another leading indicator, this is US residential building permits. And permits are a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you have to pull a permit before you build. The orange line at the top there, that's just single-family building permits, and that does not look so bad. Especially if you can ignore the 2003, 2004, 2005 period, the housing bubble period, when we're probably building too many homes and pulling too many permits. This looks pretty good. We have more permits being issued now to single-family builders than we did in years like 2012, 2013, 2014. So how is that possible, Anibal? You just said the millennials, our most populous generation, are having a tough time transacting. The oldest of the millennials will turn 45 this year, by the way. And they're having a tough time transacting. I know, time has passed, I get it. So why are home builders pulling permits if our most populous generation are having a tough time transacting? Because there's so few existing homes for sale. That single-family builders are spying opportunities to meet unmet demand, including among millennials. If you look at the average size of the newly constructed American home, it is now shrinking in terms of square footage. Why? Less square footage, fewer windows. You try to meet millennials where they are in terms of price point. Actually, lots of momentum is in that green line. That's multifamily. That relates to future apartments to be constructed. You say, Anibal, again, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, the millennials have to live someplace. They're about to turn 45, some of them. They can't live with their parents forever. They can try, but they shouldn't. So they're going to be leasing apartments. I would think under such circumstances, multifamily building permits would be quite strong. What's going on here? What's going on here is this. Increasingly, developers are having a tough time lining project finance. And sometimes they can line up the project financing, but the interest that they're being offered, whether by banks or private credit, is so high, their pro forma no longer pencils out. And even on a pro forma, you can only raise your rent so much. So, and you'll notice that in certain markets, Austin, Texas, for instance, Nashville, Tennessee, apartment rents are now falling, which means that their value as collateral has started to become more suspicious, sketchier. And so that's what we're seeing. And again, higher interest for longer continue to whittle away at that momentum we had seen in residential construction. Now, this is another leading indicator, but a bit more inclusive because it includes or encompasses certain segments of commercial real estate. This is your Architecture Billings Index. It's a reflection of how busy architects are. You see the 50-yard line in black running west-east across that slide. It makes me sad to say the 50-yard line because that reminds me of football, which reminds me of the NFL, which reminds me of the Baltimore Ravens, which reminds me of the fact that Mark Andrews has no hands. I did not want to present this slide, but I am. So any read less than 50 signifies that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. Well, 16 of the past 17 months, the reading has been below 50. The only reading above 50 was 2 months ago, and it was 50.3. So architects have become less busy. Now, why is that a leading indicator? Because if architects are less busy upstream, contractors tend to be less busy downstream. That's the notion here. Again, a lot of this relates to those commercial real estate dynamics. So again, it's the office market and the vacancy and high project financing costs. Now, some segments of construction transcend high borrowing costs because there are secular changes transpiring in the economy. That's what this slide gets at. This is for non-residential construction spending growth since February of 2020. The Census Bureau supplies 16 different segments of construction for which it produces data. This, again, February of 2020 to the latest data point that we have, which is November, if memory serves. The December data will come out in early February. So percentage growth, and if you look at it overall, the blue color bar at the top, 39.8% growth in non-residential construction spending since February 2020. You say, but that's great. And 4.5 years, 40% growth, but that does not adjust for inflation. If you adjust for inflation, growth is more like 16% in real terms, which is not terrible, but just not nearly as impressive. In other words, a lot of the construction spending growth is not because users of construction services are using that much more in service, they're paying much more for the services they've been using. Construction delivery costs have gone up tremendously in recent years for a variety of reasons, including those related to the workforce. Now, in green, you can see categorically where the growth has been. Number one category by far in terms of fomenting or translating into construction spending growth, manufacturing. Supply chain is coming back home. And now, of course, new president, focus on deregulation, focus on bulking up oil and natural gas production, Louisiana specialties. That drives down the cost of electricity. That increases American manufacturing competitiveness. Of course, there's possible tariffs afoot as well, which will also drive more manufacturing into this nation. You put all of this together, every reason to believe that Louisiana and Baton Rouge are really going to prosper during the years ahead, that you're going to see massive investment in this market, in a market that's already been vastly outperforming the balance of the Louisiana economy. Now, manufacturing is not alone in terms of triggering growth in construction spending. You see a number of public categories here. On November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In August of 2022, signed both the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. So you see a fair amount of construction related to publicly financed categories, water and sewer, highway and street, those kinds of categories. Healthcare has been another sector that has seen quite reasonable construction spending growth. Toward the bottom, you see segments like office. Now, the office category includes, as it turns out, the construction of data centers. Now, data center construction, as you know, has been furious, frenetic. But it's been the traditional office space market that has done very, very poorly, and that's why that category is stuck toward the bottom, along with lodging, which relates to new hotel room construction. Again, none of these data are adjusted for inflation. Now, just to give you some sense of what's happened with construction related to manufacturing, this is the proportion of private non-residential construction spending related to manufacturing. Today, manufacturing-related construction translates into nearly a third of all private non-residential construction spending. It's really quite remarkable, and there's more in front of us. This is the era of the mega project, so whether it's chip plants or battery factories or whatever it happens to be, it's really quite remarkable. And again, this is really a dramatic change from where we were just a few years ago. Because wasn't it a few years ago, let's say 8 or 9 years ago, that the conclusion was that America is going to become a service sector-oriented economy? The manufacturer will go elsewhere, that we're all going to be physicians and accountants and attorneys and economists and so on and so forth. None of that is particularly attractive. But now, of course, America is diversifying economically. We're an industrial powerhouse once again, and we are set to become even more of one during the years ahead, and Louisiana is very much a part of that story. So let's go to the final part of the presentation. The glory is yours, because this presentation is just about over. More impacts from the election. Leading indicator. This is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question Small Business America. Is this a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? Pre-election, 4% of small business operators said, yeah, it's a good time to expand my business. Post-election, 20%. You see that vertical line at the right there? That's Donald Trump. I'm not saying whether that optimism is justified or not. That's for you to decide. But it would appear that many small businesses are on the front foot, looking to expand, thinking it's a good time to expand my business, whether because of reasons of deregulation, expected tax cuts, whatever it happens to be. And that's good because, again, there are some indications that at least parts of the labor market are softening. So this is the US hires rate, literally the number of hires in any given month in the economy divided by the number of people receiving a paycheck that month. It's been falling, quite dangerously, actually. That's why many economists have suggested the probability of recession is still non-zero. But if small business is now on the front foot, once again, more confident, they're more likely to pick up the pace of hiring, and so, again, that virtuous cycle is more likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future. Now, it doesn't mean the economy is not going to soften. This is one of my favorite leading indicators. There's actually 10 leading indicators all bundled in one composite index being graphed for you here. It's an index of predicted, this is the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators. It's an index of predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09, is now generally telling us the US economy is set to soften a bit. But of course, that doesn't mean that much because we had such a good year last year macroeconomically, with the exception, of course, of that elevated rate of inflation. So if you look at various forecasts for the US in terms of growth, the green colored bars are 2024 estimates from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The blue colored bars are forecasts for 2025. Almost all of them are forecasting that the economy is going to soften, but just a bit, just a bit. And of course, the wild card, as is often the case, is Donald Trump himself. What are the policies? If I'm not mistaken, in the last few days, he enacted 25% tariffs on the Colombian economy. That was when he was playing on the third hole. As it turns out, he was playing golf at the moment. By the eighth hole, those tariffs were gone. And that tells us he's a very bad golfer, for one, because it took a long time to get from the third to the eighth hole, but also that, this policymaking is uncertain. So we shall see. I will tell you something, I speak to a lot of groups that tend to be to the right of center, a lot of small business groups, for instance, and they tell me, Aniban, don't take Donald Trump literally, just take him seriously. You know generally where he wants to push the economy, where he wants to push the country. And one thing he does not want to do is hurt the stock market's performance. He uses that as a metric for his success. So a lot of people say, yes, there's lots of posturing and ideation, but at the end of the day, he's likely to be a pro-growth president, and we shall see. So with that, let me sum it up here. Where we headed, I think inflation might be making a bit of a comeback because we have some inflationary policies potentially enforced. If I were a presidential advisor, by the way, and I'm not, but if I were, I might say to President Trump, with all respect, don't do too much. Because what you need to do, sir, if you want a Keystone Pipeline and deregulation of oil and natural gas production, I understand that completely, high-profile deportations, I understand that. But I think interest rates stay higher for longer. One of the other questions is, are asset prices too high? We have a price-earnings ratio on the S&P 500 that's been above 20. It's quite high by historic standards. And so I think this is going to be a year of growth, but there are some risks here in the form of stubbornly high interest rates and asset prices that could be quite volatile. You might have seen a couple of days ago the impact on NVIDIA from a company named DeepSeek in China, creating a new AI platform for pennies on the dollar. And in one day, NVIDIA stock value or enterprise value falling about $600 billion. So there's some risks out there, but I still think it's going to be a year of growth.
I'm Amy Odom. I work for BASF Chemical Company in Geismar. We are the world's largest chemical company, and I'm participating in the GBRIA event today just to learn about what our industry is doing, and particularly where we're going to make the world a greener place. The real importance of this conference is that to achieve all of our goals, we're going to all have to work together and collaborate on some solutions. So it's good to hear what everyone else is doing, where we can learn from them and share a little bit about what we're doing, so we can decide where areas that we can work together. These are really important for Louisiana because they focus on Louisiana-centered businesses, and Louisiana has a lot of unique opportunities and challenges. As a state, we're very oil and gas rich and a very heavily chemically based economy here. So being able to meet with folks that are doing the same things is very important to the economy for Louisiana, for jobs in the future. And some of the green projects are kind of the new future for Louisiana. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to network with other folks in the industry.
My name's John Flake. I'm a professor of chemical engineering at LSU, and I'm talking about CO2 utilization today. For me, it's an opportunity to share my research, to talk about the how and the details and how we might commercialize it, and it fits with the chemical industry in Louisiana. I've always had a passion for chemistry, chemical engineering, and I really like sharing what we're doing at the university. There's a huge potential to commercialize that. These guys do it every day. They're huge commercial operations. So I'm at a university, we have a part of a startup, and so we're trying to get to that level, and these guys, sharing our ideas and getting feedback from them is really helpful.
My name is Michael Mazzola, and I am the Executive Director, CEO of FUEL, which stands for Future Use of Energy in Louisiana, a National Science Foundation innovation engine. And what I'm doing here today is the to be the closing speaker of this wonderful annual meeting of the GBRIA organization. This industry is one of the most, if not the most important in Louisiana. It provides tens of thousands of jobs that are good paying and require a lot of coordination, a lot of joint actions, especially in education and workforce development, and best safety practices and environmental practices, and the plan for the future of this industry to keep it strong and growing. Louisiana should be very proud of the fact that we were one of 10 in the country to win the largest program the National Science Foundation has ever awarded. It's worth up to $160 million for 10 years. And it was extremely competitive, but Louisiana demonstrated that not only do we have strong industries and plants, but we also have the potential to change our industry through starting small companies and doing tech-enabled innovation. We could be the next Silicon Valley of energy in the world, right here in Louisiana.
We're so blessed, right, to be in such a great state where the chemical manufacturing, our contractors, and support organizations can all come here today and celebrate what we do by working safely every day, creating great paying jobs for the future, and producing the products that everybody uses every day.
Today's turnout is fantastic. We have a huge crowd. We filled the room, and it shows the support that we have, and this shows the interest in industry growing in Louisiana. The best source to learn more about GBRIA is just on our website at gbria.org.